Mountain Man marries obese teen as a bet, is shocked what happens next. The church bell tolls. Dust rises in the street. A rugged mountain man stands at the altar, his face heavy with shame. Beside him, a young bride, large, radiant, smiling. With pure joy takes his hand as whispers ripple through the crowd. This marriage isn't built on love. It's born from a cruel bet made in a whiskey-soaked saloon. Everyone's waiting for her to fall, for him to walk away. But then, one quiet prayer overheard in the night begins to shake his heart. And a hidden deed, tied to the valley's only spring, pulls them into a fight against men who will stop at nothing to claim the water. What starts as a joke marriage soon becomes the center of a battle over dignity, faith, and survival. Will the man who married her in shame find the courage to stand proudly by her side? Or will the cruel bet destroy them both before love has a chance to bloom? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The Last Chance Saloon hummed with the rough voices of trail-weary cowboys. Lamplight caught the amber glow of whiskey bottles behind the bar, while tobacco smoke hung thick in the air like morning fog. The cattle drive had ended, bringing with it a payday and the loose tongues that followed too much drinking. Boone. Riker sat alone in the corner, his scarred hands wrapped around a tin cup. He preferred the quiet of mountain trails to the press of bodies and the sharp laughter that filled the saloon. His weather-beaten face remained half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, hoping to avoid notice. "Hey, mountain man," a burly cowhand called out, swaggering toward Boone's table. "Ain't seen you down from your cave in a while." Boone kept his eyes on his drink, jaw tight. The smart thing would be to leave, to slip out into the night where only the coyotes would judge him. But something in him had grown tired of running. "What brings you to town?" Another ranch hand joined in, finally ready to join the living. "Supply." "Run," Boone muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Nothing more. The first cowboy, red-faced from drink, pulled up a chair uninvited. "Well now, boys, maybe old Riker here is looking for a wife." This brought howls of laughter from the growing crowd. "Speaking of wives," someone called out, "did you see Reverend Mayfield's girl at church Sunday? Lord above, she's gotten bigger than ever." Boone's fingers tightened around his cup. He'd seen Clara Mayfield from afar, noticed how she moved with quiet grace despite the cruel whispers that followed her. How she always had a kind word for the children who crossed her path. "Ain't no man gonna want that one," the burly cowhand sneered. "Don't matter how good she cooks or how sweet she talks." The whiskey burned in Boone's belly, mixing with an anger he couldn't explain. These men who'd never known real hardship beyond. A long day's ride, mocking a girl who'd done nothing to deserve their scorn. "You're wrong." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. The saloon grew quiet, all eyes turning to his corner. The burly cowhand leaned forward, a mean glint in his eye. "That so? Maybe you're sweet on her yourself, mountain man?" "Maybe I am." Boone's voice was steady, even as his mind screamed at him to stop. "Prove it then." The cowboy slammed his hand on the table. "Marry her. Within the week. Show us all how wrong we are." Laughter erupted again, cruel and sharp as winter wind. Someone shouted about fetching the preacher. Another began calculating odds on whether Boone would actually go through with it. Done. The word fell like a stone in still water. Boone stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'll marry her by week's end." The crowd erupted in whoops and hollers, men already planning how they'd convince the Reverend to agree to such a hasty marriage. Boone pushed through them, out into the cold night air, his stomach churning with shame. What had he done? He'd meant to defend her honor, but instead, he'd made her the subject of an even crueler jest. The thought of Clara's face when she learned of this bet made him sick to his soul. Across town, Warm lamplight spilled from the church windows. Clara moved between the wooden pews, gathering up forgotten hymnals and straightening the simple cushions. Her father's cough echoed from his study, where he worked late into the night on Sunday's sermon. "Almost finished, Papa," she called out, her voice gentle. The church always felt peaceful at this hour, when the last echoes of the congregation had faded away. Here, she could forget the sideways glances, the whispered comments about her size, the way mothers pulled their children closer when she passed by. Clara paused at the last pew, running her hand along the smooth wood. In the quiet, she let herself dream of a different life, of someone who might see past her outer shell to the heart that beat beneath, someone who might value her gentle spirit, her love of God's creatures, her way with children. "Lord," she whispered, her prayer barely stirring the air, "I know I'm not like other girls. I know I'm not what most men want. But if it's your will, might you send someone who could love me as I am? Someone who needs the kind of love I have to give?" She didn't know that at that very moment, a troubled mountain man was walking the cold streets, trapped by a foolish promise that would change both their lives forever. She couldn't hear the raucous laughter still echoing from the saloon, or know that her name was being passed around like a joke. Instead, Clara finished her tasks with care, helped her father lock up the church, and walked home under the star-filled sky, holding her dreams close to her heart like precious gems. The morning sun brought no comfort to Boone Riker as he rode his horse down Main Street. His head throbbed with each clip-clop of hooves against packed dirt, punishment for last night's whiskey. But the ache in his conscience cut deeper than any hangover. Townsfolk gathered in whispered clusters as he passed. Outside the general store, Mrs. Henderson leaned close to Mrs. Peters, both women's eyes following him with poorly concealed interest. Even the children stopped their games to stare, one small boy pointing openly before his mother swatted his hand down. "Heard he's gonna marry the preacher's girl," a voice carried from the boardwalk. "Clara Mayfield?" "Well, ain't that something?" another answered. Boone pulled his hat lower, shame burning in his gut. He tied his horse outside the saloon where several of last night's cowboys lounged against the hitching post. "Come to call off the bet?" The burly ranch hand from the night before grinned. "Figured you might lose your nerve in the daylight." "This ain't right," Boone said quietly. "The girl don't deserve to be part of some foolish wager." "Your word's given," another cowboy drawled. "Unless you're saying a mountain man's promise means nothing." Boone's jaw clenched. In the mountains, a man's word was all he had. Break it once, and you'd never be trusted again. The thought of backing down, of proving these men right about him being nothing but a coward, stuck in his craw with heavy steps. He walked the 3 blocks to the parsonage. The small white house sat neat and trim beside the church, morning glories climbing its porch rails. Before he could knock, Reverend Mayfield opened the door. The old preacher's eyes were sharp, despite his frail frame. "Brother Riker," he said carefully, "this is unexpected." "Sir." Boone removed his hat, twisting the brim. "Might I speak with you? And your daughter?" The Reverend studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. "Clara," he called softly, "we have a visitor." She appeared from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, cheeks pink from the cook stove's heat. Her eyes widened at the sight of Boone, and something like hope flickered across her face. "Mr. Riker," she said softly, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. Boone's carefully prepared speech dried up in his throat. Up close, her eyes were kind, reminding him of clear mountain springs. The thought of what he was about to do made him sick. "Miss Mayfield." He cleared his throat. "I've come with a purpose. I mean to ask for your hand in marriage." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The Reverend stepped forward, protective. "This is rather sudden," he said. You've barely spoken 2 words to my daughter before today. I've watched from afar, Boone found himself saying. Seen her kindness to others, her gentle spirit. Each word of truth only made his deception worse. Papa, Clara whispered, her voice trembling with joy. Remember what we prayed for? God has answered. The Reverend's face softened at his daughter's happiness, though concern still creased his brow. Clara, child, perhaps we should take some. Time to please, Papa. She reached for his hand. I accept, Mr. Raker, with all my heart. News spread through town like wildfire. By afternoon, women crowded the parsonage, helping Clara alter her mother's old wedding dress. Through the window, Boone could hear their excited chatter and Clara's happy laughter. He retreated to the livery stable, a bottle his only company. The horses watched with disinterested eyes as he slumped in the corner, trying to drink away the image of Clara's trusting face. Lord above, he muttered, what have I done? The setting sun painted the sky crimson when the church bells began to ring. Townsfolk filed into the small building, more out of curiosity than celebration. Women whispered behind their fans about the hasty ceremony, while men exchanged knowing looks in the church's back room. Clara's friends fussed over her patched dress and borrowed veil. Tears of joy streaked her cheeks as Mrs. Henderson pinned her mother's brooch to her collar. It's like a fairy tale, she whispered, squeezing her friend's hands. He chose me. He really chose me. Meanwhile, Boone stood in the stable shadows, watching the church fill up. His feet felt leaden, his chest tight with guilt. But there was no escape now. His word was given, and half the county had ridden in to see him keep it. The final bell rang out across the town as dusk settled over the land. It was time. The church's oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls as Clara stepped through the doorway. Her borrowed veil trembled with each breath, and her eyes shone bright with unshed tears of joy. The assembled townsfolk turned to watch her progress, their whispers hushing as Reverend Mayfield guided his daughter down the narrow aisle. Boone stood at the altar like a man facing judgment, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his best buckskin coat. His weathered face might have been carved from granite, jaw clenched tight against words he couldn't speak. Only his eyes betrayed movement, darting between Clara's radiant smile and the snickering men near the back pews. Clara's hand shook as she placed it in Boone's calloused palm. Her fingers were soft and warm against his skin, trusting as a child's. The touch seemed to burn him, but he forced himself to hold on, knowing every eye in the church watched for signs of weakness. Dearly beloved, Reverend Mayfield began, his voice catching slightly. He paused, studying Boone's stony expression with growing concern. But Clara squeezed Boone's hand, and the preacher continued, We are gathered here in the sight of God. Through the ceremony, Clara's tears fell freely, her whole being luminous with happiness. Each I do from her lips rang with certainty and hope. When Boone spoke the same words, his voice was rough as pine bark, but steady enough to mask the lie. Outside the church, the celebration moved to the Last Chance Saloon. Men slapped coins onto the bar, settling wagers with barely concealed laughter. Never thought he'd go through with it, one ranch hand chuckled, pocketing his winnings. Reckon that mountain man's got more grit than sense. But Clara noticed none of this as Boone led her to his cabin by the creek. The small structure hunched beneath towering pines, its log walls weathered silver by sun and storm. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney where someone, probably Mrs. Henderson, had laid a fire and left a simple supper warming. Oh, Clara breathed, taking in the single room with shining eyes. It's perfect, Mr. Rickaboone, our home. She moved to the crude table where a pot of beans and cornbread waited. I'll have it fixed up proper in no time. Some curtains maybe, and I can patch that hole in the roof before winter. Her happy chatter filled the cabin like birdsong, but Boone felt suffocated by it. Without a word, he stepped outside into the gathering dusk. The creek's eternal mumbling offered no comfort as he leaned against the rough wall, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. Through the cabin's single window, lamplight spilled out like honey. He could see Clara moving about, straightening his few possessions with gentle hands. Her humming drifted through the thin walls, some hymn about amazing grace. The sound of her voice changed, growing softer, and Boone realized she was speaking. "No praying." He inched closer to the window, drawn despite himself. Clara knelt beside the narrow bed, her hands clasped beneath her chin. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "I hardly know how to thank you. All these years, I thought no one would ever want me, that I was too plain and too heavy to find love. But you sent me Boone." Her voice trembled. "I know I don't deserve such a kind man, someone so strong and honorable. Please help me be a good wife to him. Help me make this cabin a real home, full of warmth and welcome." Boone stood frozen, each word striking him like physical blows. Kind? Honorable? The bitter taste of shame filled his mouth. He thought of the coins changing hands at the saloon, of Clara's father's worried eyes, of his own coward silence in the face of her innocent joy. "And Lord," Clara continued, "please bless Boone. Keep him safe in the mountains, and help him know how grateful I am that he chose me. In Jesus' name, amen." Something cracked in Boone's chest, something he'd thought long dead. He pressed a hand against the cabin wall, needing its solid strength to keep him upright. For the first time since that fatal night in the saloon, he felt the full weight of what he'd done, not just to his own honor, but to this gentle soul who saw only goodness in his cruel dissection. The creek kept flowing, its voice unchanged. But Boone Riker stood in the deepening night, a changed man, as shame worked its way through the hard shell of years like water wearing down stone. Dawn painted the cabin windows with pale gold as Clara hummed over the cast-iron stove. The scent of coffee and flapjacks filled the small space, mixing with fresh-swept pine needles from her early morning cleaning. Her hands moved with practiced grace, flipping each cake at just the right moment while keeping the coffee from boiling over. Boone sat at the rough table, watching her efficient movements with growing unease. She had somehow transformed his bachelor's hovel overnight, setting his few possessions to rights and brightening dark corners. The cabin felt different, warmer somehow, despite the morning chill. "I hope you like them not too thick," Clara said, sliding 3 golden flapjacks onto his tin plate. Mama always said the secret was beating just enough air into the batter. Her smile was as warm as the food she served. Boone grunted in response, unable to meet her eager gaze. He ate quickly, the usually welcome taste of butter and maple sitting heavy in his stomach. As soon as politeness allowed, he pushed back from the table. "Got business in town?" he muttered, reaching for his hat. "Of course. I'll have supper waiting when you return." Clara's voice followed him out the door, full of a trust he hadn't earned. The morning air was crisp, his horse's breath streaming white in the sunshine. Boone rode slowly, taking the long way into town, but even the back trail couldn't help him. Avoid the mercantile forever. Bell chimes announced his entry into Peterson's store. The usual morning crowd of ranchers and townsmen turned as one, grins spreading across their faces. "Well, if it ain't the lucky bridegroom," Tom Peterson called out. "How's married life treating you, Riker?" Laughter rippled through the store. Boone's jaw tightened as he gathered his supplies, ignoring the elbows and knowing looks. "Bet she makes a fine breakfast," one ranch hand smirked. "Woman that size surely knows her way around a kitchen." "Leave it," Boone growled, but the words only encouraged more snickers. He paid quickly and escaped into the street, his purchases stuffed hastily into his saddlebags. The sound of their laughter seemed to follow him out of town, Near noon, he stopped at Willow Creek to water his horse. The stream burbled clear and strong, fed by mountain springs above. He was surprised to find old Jake Murphy there, the territory's most experienced surveyor, studying the water flow with professional interest. "Morning, Riker." Jake nodded. "I heard tell you married Preacher Mayfield's girl. News travels fast." Boone's tone warned against further comment. Interesting timing. Jake continued, ignoring the warning. "Seeing as how the Reverend just signed over them water rights to her last month. That spring up on Mayfield's Ridge feeds half the valley in dry years." Boone's head snapped up. "What water rights? Oh, you didn't know?" Jake scratched his beard thoughtfully. "That ridgeland's been in the family since first settlement. Controls the headwaters, so to speak. During drought, whoever owns that spring could damn near strangle the whole valley." He eyed Boone sideways. "Worth quite a bit to the right buyers." The ride home seemed longer than usual, Jake's words echoing in Boone's mind. The setting sun cast long shadows when he finally reached the cabin. Clara had been busy all day. Fresh swept. Dirt showed boot prints only at the door, and his few windows gleamed. The table bore a checked cloth he'd never seen before, and the smell of beef stew made his stomach growl despite his troubled thoughts. "Welcome home." Clara beamed, ladling generous portions into their bowls. "I found some late berries by the creek for dessert." She chatted as they ate, sharing stories of her father's circuit-riding days and her dreams for their home. "Papa always said a house needs 3 things to be a proper home: God's word, warm bread, and peace between its walls." Her eyes shone with sincerity. "I aim to have all 3 here." Boone listened with growing discomfort, watching her honest face in the lamplight. There was no guile there, no hidden scheme behind her plans for curtains and herb gardens. After Clara retired behind the calico screen she'd hung for privacy, Boone found himself drawn to her small trunk of possessions. The deed was there, along with a leather-bound journal. His conscience pricked as he opened them, but he had to know. The documents confirmed Jake's words. The spring and surrounding acres were indeed Clara's inheritance, but it was her journal that caught his attention. Careful sketches showed the spring's course, with notes about water flow and seasonal changes. Between the drawings were entries about sharing agreements with neighboring Ute families and her father's teaching about stewardship of God's gifts. "The water belongs to the land," she'd written, "and the land belongs to all God's children. Papa says we're just caretakers, man, to share his blessings freely." Boone closed the journal, his weathered hands gentle on its worn cover. He'd married Clara for a cruel joke, only to find himself tied to both valuable property and precious principles. The weight of it settled around his shoulders like a heavy winter coat, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Days stretched into a quiet rhythm at the cabin by the creek. Clara rose before dawn each morning, stoking the stove and setting coffee to boil while pale light crept through the windows. The smell of biscuits and bacon soon filled the small space, drawing Boone from his bedroll near the door. They ate in silence most mornings, but Clara hummed as she worked, her hands never idle. She brought 3 laying hens home one afternoon, paid for with coins saved from mending clothes for townswomen. The chickens scratched contentedly in the yard now, providing fresh eggs and giving Clara someone to talk to during the long days. Boone spent his hours chopping wood until the pile grew taller than Clara herself. He'd disappear into the woods, with his rifle, returning with rabbits or a deer haunch. Though he kept his distance, Clara noticed he'd begun leaving his muddy boots outside and washing up before meals stopped one crisp afternoon. Clara tied on her best bonnet and gathered her basket. "I need fabric from Peterson's store," she announced. "We're nearly out of flour, too." Boone looked up from cleaning his rifle. "I can fetch supplies." "That's kind, but I like to choose my own cloth." Clara smoothed her faded dress. Besides, the fresh air will do me good. She felt Boone's eyes on her back as she walked down a path. The town wasn't far, but Clara took her time, gathering late wildflowers along the way. She'd learned long ago to move at her own pace, no matter who might stare. The bell above Peterson's door announced her arrival. Conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned. Clara pretended not to notice the whispers that followed her down the aisles. Land's sake, she'd clear out half our stock just clothing herself, one woman muttered, loud enough to carry. Tell she ate 3 whole pies at the church social, another added with a sniff. Clara kept her chin high, carefully selecting sturdy cotton and cheerful colors. She'd weathered worse storms than petty gossip. As she waited to pay, small faces appeared at the store window. Clara smiled, reaching into her basket for the extra biscuits she'd packed that morning. Outside, children gathered around her like chicks to a mother hen. Miss Clara, Miss Clara. They crowded close, reaching for the treats she handed out. Mind your manners now, she reminded them gently. There's plenty for everyone. Mama says you make the best biscuits in the territory, little Sarah Jenkins declared, crumbs on her chin. That's because they're made with love, Clara answered, touching the girl's nose. Just like my mama taught me. From the shadows between buildings, Moon watched unnoticed. He'd followed at a distance, telling himself he needed supplies. But now he found himself studying Clara's face as she dealt with both cruelty and kindness. There was something there, a quiet strength he hadn't expected. That evening, Clara stirred the stew pot while Boone brought in more firewood. Steam rose from the bubbling pot, carrying the scent of sage and thyme from her small herb garden. Papa always said God's gifts were meant for sharing, Clara said suddenly, breaking their usual silence. That's why he made sure everyone knew they could draw water from our spring, even in the driest years. She stirred thoughtfully. The Ute families especially, their children need clean water same as any others. Boone set the logs down carefully. Some folks won't take kindly to that notion. Cattle barons especially. I reckon that's their burden to bear. Clara's voice was gentle but firm. Papa taught me right from wrong doesn't change just because some folk disagree. After supper, Clara took down her worn hymn book. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling. As she placed it carefully on the shelf beside her Bible, she began to hum softly. The melody filled their small cabin like sunshine after rain. Boone found himself lingering at the table, pipe forgotten in his hand. Something stirred in his chest, unfamiliar and uncomfortable as a new shoe. Clara's voice rose and fell, sweet and clear as the creek water, and the cabin seemed to grow warmer despite the evening chill. He watched her move about the cabin, straightening things already neat, still humming. Her face glowed in the lamplight, at peace with herself and her place in the world. For the first time, Moon saw past her size to something that made his throat tight, a beauty that had nothing to do with shapes or surfaces. The feeling followed him outside when he went to check the horses. It waited in the shadows when he came back in. Even after Clara retired behind her calico screen, that unnamed emotion lingered like wood smoke in still air, impossible to wave away. Word spread through the valley like wildfire after a lightning strike. The cattle barons had their eyes on Clara's spring, and their greed was as deep as their pockets. Boone noticed the change first in how the townsfolk watched him, sideways glances heavy with meaning, whispered conversations that died when he passed. The summons came on a Tuesday morning. Pete Morrison, who worked at the saloon, caught Boone outside the general store. "Boys want to see you at the last chance," he muttered, not meeting Boone's eyes. "Tonight. Important business, they say." Boone's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. The sun was setting when he pushed through the saloon doors that evening. Smoke hung thick in the air, and conversations hushed as he entered. In the back corner, 4 men sat around the table, Harry Webb and his cattle-bearing friends, each worth more than every other soul in the valley combined. "Riker," Webb called out, gesturing to an empty chair. "Join us." Boone settled into the seat, his back to the wall. The other patrons pretended not to watch, but their ears strained to catch every word. Webb leaned forward, his voice low and friendly. "Been thinking about that bet that got you hitched." He smiled, but his eyes were cold as river rocks. "Reckon it's time to settle up proper." "Bet's done," Boone said flatly. "Marriage is real enough." One of the other men, Thompson, cleared his throat. "Thing is, Riker, it's spring on your wife's land. It's causing some concern. Drought's coming. Valley needs that water managed proper like. Clara manages it fine. Does she now?" Webb's smile turned sharp. "Heard tell she's planning to honor some fool promise her daddy made to the Ute. Can't have that. Not with honest. Rancher's cattle at stake." Boone's hands clenched beneath the table. "What are you asking?" "Just have her sign the deed over. We'll make it worth your while." Webb slid a folded paper across the table. "More money than you'd see in 10 years of trapping." "And if I don't?" "Then folks might start remembering how this marriage came about." Thompson's voice was soft. "Mighty shame if everyone knew the preacher's daughter was nothing but a drunken wager." Boone's throat went dry. His voice wavered slightly as he answered, "No deal." "Sleep on it," Webb suggested. "Talk it over with your bride." "We'll wait, but—" "Not long." The walk home seemed longer than usual. Boone's boots kicked up dust in the darkness, his mind churning like rapids in spring flood. Through the cabin window, he could see Clara sitting by the fire, needle flashing as she worked on a quilt spread across her lap. She looked up when he entered, her face bright. "You're just in time. I found Pape's old journal today while cleaning. There's something I want to show you." Boone hung his hat and settled into the chair beside her. Clara reached for a leather-bound book on the table, its pages yellow with age. She opened it carefully, revealing neat rows of writing and detailed sketches. "See here?" She pointed to a hand-drawn map. "Papa mapped the whole spring system. Shows how the water feeds down through the valley." She turned another page, where a note was written in careful script. "And this is the promise he made to Running Deer's people during the big drought 15 years ago." Boone leaned closer to read. The words were simple but binding. Water flows for all God's children. In times of drought, the Utes shall have their share, as neighbors and friends. Under heaven. Clara's fingers traced the words gently. "Some folks in town already whisper about me giving water to Indians. They say worse things too, but I don't mind that so much." She looked up at Boone, her eyes steady. "Papa taught me that doing right matters more than what people think. Reputation's just smoke in the wind, but righteousness, that's solid as stone." Boone stared into the fire, feeling the weight of years spent thinking only of survival. He'd learned to trust no one, to take what he could get, to ignore the voice of conscience. But sitting beside Clara, watching her steady hand smooth the journal's pages, he felt something shift inside him like spring ice breaking. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the wall as they sat in silence. The town's cruel wager that had pushed him into this marriage now seemed like a tiny thing compared to the choice before him. Clara's quiet faith, her father's promise, the land itself, all of it wound together like the threads in her quilt, creating something larger than himself. He watched her return to her stitching, her needle moving sure and steady through the fabric. The firelight caught the simple gold band on her finger, a ring he'd chosen in haste, but that she wore with dignity. In that moment, Boone understood that the bet had tied him to something far deeper than he'd ever imagined, something that would test every hard lesson he'd learned in his years of solitude. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, with golden light spilling across the valley. Clara had risen before the sun, humming softly as she pressed her best dress and packed baskets with fresh-baked pies for the church supper. Boone watched her bustle about, her movements quick and sure despite her size. The church bell rang across the quiet morning as they approached in their wagon. Clara smoothed their skirts, excitement brightening her face. "I do love Sundays," she said, gathering her hymnal close. "Everyone coming together to worship. It's like a little piece of heaven." Boone helped her down from the wagon, noting how other churchgoers paused to watch them. Some still whispered behind their hands, but Clara paid them no mind as she made her way to the front of the church, where the small choir gathered. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Clara's voice rose with the opening hymn. Boone sat stiffly in the back pew, unused to church services, but found himself drawn to the sound of her singing. Her voice carried sweet and strong through the wooden rafters, her face glowing with joy as she led the congregation in amazing grace. After the service, the churchyard transformed into a bustling social gathering. Clara had set up tables laden with her cooking, golden-crusted pies, tender roast beef, and fresh bread that made mouths water. The aroma drew people in despite themselves. "Miss Clara, I mean Mrs. Riker," old Widow Thompson called out. "This apple pie reminds me of my mother's cooking." Her weathered face creased in a genuine smile as Clara beamed at the compliment. Children darted between the tables, faces sticky with pie filling. "Can we have more, Mrs. Riker?" they pleaded, and Clara laughed warmly as she cut generous slices. Even those who had once mocked her size now found themselves asking for seconds of her cooking. Boone stood back in the shade of an oak tree, watching. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest as he observed Clara in her element, serving, laughing, bringing people together with her food and warmth. She fairly glowed with happiness, and for the first time, he felt a flash of pride in calling her wife. "Your Clara sure knows how to bring folks together," Reverend Stevens commented, joining Boone beneath the tree. "Been a long time since we've had a church supper this well attended." Boone nodded, unable to hide a small smile as Clara's laugh rang out across the yard. She was showing a group of young girls how to fold napkins into fancy shapes, her hands moving with surprising grace. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the churchyard, Boone helped Clara pack up the empty dishes and remaining food into their wagon. Her cheeks were flushed from the day's activities, her eyes bright with contentment. "Thank you for coming today," she said softly as they drove home. "I know church ain't really your usual way of spending Sunday." The wagon wheels creaked steadily as Clara chattered about the day, how little Tommy had asked for 3 helpings of pie, how Mrs. Thompson had shared her mother's secret for flaky crusts, how the choir had finally mastered that tricky part in the new hymn. Boone found himself listening with unexpected interest, offering occasional grunts of acknowledgement that made Clara smile wider. Back at their cabin, Clara paused before going inside. "It means the world to me, you know," she said quietly. "Having you stand beside me today makes me feel," she trailed off, searching for words, "makes me feel not so alone anymore." Boone helped her carry the baskets inside, watching as she moved about the cabin with familiar ease, putting things away and humming snippets of hymns. The space felt different somehow, warmer, more like home than it had in all his years of solitary living. Later that night, Boone lay awake in his bedroll by the fire, listening to Clara's steady breathing from behind the curtain that divided the cabin. The shame that had burned in his gut since making that drunken bet had faded, replaced by something gentler. He thought of her standing proud in church, sharing her food with those who'd once scorned her, laughing with children who now adored her. Something was growing in his heart, tender as a spring shoot, fragile as a bird's egg. He wasn't ready to name it yet, but it was there all the same, taking root in the hard soil of his soul. The dying embers cast soft shadows on the cabin walls as Boone finally drifted toward sleep. Clara's hymn still echoing in his mind. Thunder rumbled in the distance as three well-dressed men stormed into town on expensive horses. Their polished boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk as they marched toward the Last Chance Saloon, where Boone sat nursing a coffee. Riker! The tallest of them, Charles Montgomery, burst through the swinging doors. His suit cost more than most miners made in a year. Where's that wife of yours? We need to settle this water rights business once and for all. Boone's jaw tightened as he set down his cup. Before he could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway, her basket of fresh bread forgotten at her side. I'm right here, Mr. Montgomery, she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Boone moved to stand between them, his weathered frame blocking their path to Clara. Montgomery pulled a stack of papers from his coat. We've got witnesses, Riker. Whole saloon full of men who'll testify this marriage was nothing but a drunken. Bet. He slapped the documents onto the bar, which makes it legally void. No valid union means no protection for her father's water rights. Clara's sharp intake of breath cut through the tense silence. Her fingers clutched Boone's arm, seeking stability as her world threatened to crumble. That ain't true, Boone growled, though his voice held less certainty than he'd hoped. Oh, but it is. Montgomery's partner, Edwin Blake, stepped forward with a cruel smile. Got it all written here. Dates, witnesses, even the exact amount wagered. No judge will uphold a marriage founded on such unseemly circumstances. The saloon had grown crowded as townsfolk gathered to watch. Clara stood frozen, her face pale as flour as the truth of her marriage's origins became clear. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and someone snickered. Just then, Reverend Mayfield pushed through the crowd, his Bible clutched to his chest. Now see here, he declared, his frail voice carrying unexpected authority. These two were joined in holy matrimony before God and this congregation. No man's games can nullify what the Lord has blessed. The law says different, Montgomery sneered. We'll see what the circuit judge has to say about it when he arrives next week. Until then, he turned to Clara. I suggest you consider signing over those water rights. Might make this whole mess go away. Boone's hands clenched into fists, but Clara's grip on his arm kept him still. The cattle barons swept out, leaving their threats hanging in the air like gun smoke. The ride home was silent save for the creak of wagon wheels. Clara stared straight ahead, her usual cheerful chatter absent. When they reached the cabin, she moved mechanically through her evening tasks, dropping a pan with a clatter that made them both jump. Finally, as darkness crept in, Clara sank onto a chair by the fire. Her shoulders began to shake with quiet sobs. It's true then, she whispered. You only married me because of a bet? Boone stood awkwardly by the door, shame burning in his gut. Clara, all this time, she continued, tears streaming down her round cheeks. I believed God had answered my prayers. That someone finally saw past. She gestured at herself, her voice breaking. But I was just a joke. Something to laugh at. The pain in her voice cut deeper than any knife Boone had ever known. He crossed the room slowly and lowered himself onto the bench beside her. Started that way, he admitted roughly, staring into the fire. Won't lie to you about that. But Clara, he struggled to find words, unused to speaking from the heart. You've shown more courage than any man I've known, standing up to those cattle barons, sharing with folks who mock you, living your faith plain and true. Clara wiped her eyes with her apron, her breath hitching. I have to trust God, she whispered. Even in this trial, even when it hurts so bad I can hardly breathe. She looked up at him, her face tear-stained but determined. He ain't failed me yet, and I reckon he won't start now. Boone sat in silence, feeling the weight of the choice before him. The whole town would be watching when the judge arrived. He'd have to decide where he stood, with the powerful cattle barons who could make his life easy, or with this woman whose quiet strength had begun to change his heart. Clara's quiet humming of an old hymn filled the cabin as she wiped her eyes and began to prepare for bed. The sound wrapped around Boone like a familiar blanket, making the cabin feel more like home than it had in all his years of solitary living. Boone tossed and turned through the night, his conscience gnawing at him, like a coyote at old bones. Clara's quiet sobs from earlier echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of cruel laughter from the saloon. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the cabin window, he made his decision. He dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Clara. His bait. Boots whispered against the rough wooden floor as he retrieved her father's journal from its shelf. The leather-bound book felt heavy in his hands, weighted with promises and truth. Clara stirred as he reached the door. "Boone?" she murmured sleepily. "Where you headed so early?" "Got business to tend to," he answered gruffly. "I'll be back till nightfall." She nodded, trust in her eyes that made his chest ache. "I'll keep supper warm." The morning air bit cold. As Boone saddled his horse, frost crunched under hooves as they set out, following the winding creek upstream toward the Ute winter camp. The journey would take half a day if he pushed hard, following trails he knew from his trapping days. The sun climbed higher as Boone rode, casting long shadows through the pines. He rehearsed his words carefully, knowing the importance of showing proper respect to Chief Nanton. The journal bounced against his chest, secured inside his coat dot by midday. Smoke from the Ute camp rose through the trees. Two young braves appeared on horseback, rifles ready but not aimed. They recognized Boone from trading and escorted him. Into camp. Chief Nanton sat outside his lodge, his face weathered as old leather but his eyes sharp as flint. He raised a hand in greeting as Boone dismounted. "Many winters since you visited our fires, mountain man," Nanton said in careful English. Boone bowed his head respectfully. "Chief Nanton, I come seeking your help." He withdrew the journal from his coat. "This belonged to Reverend Mayfield. His daughter Clara, my wife now, she inherited his spring." Nanton's expression softened at the mention of the preacher. Ah, the man of God. He spoke true words, kept true promises. "You remember him then?" Boone asked, hope rising in his chest. "How? Could I forget?" Nanton took the journal carefully, his fingers tracing the worn cover. "When drought came, his spring gave life to our people. He said water was Creator's gift, meant for sharing." Boone nodded, then explained about the cattle barons, their threats, and how they aimed to void his marriage to Clara. His voice grew rough as he described how the town mocked her, treated her as less than human. They laugh at her size, scorn. "Her gentle heart," Boone said, surprising himself with the anger in his voice. "But she stays strong, keeps her faith, wants to honor her father's promise to your people, no matter the cost." Nanton listened in silence, occasionally nodding. When Boone finished, the chief sat quiet for several long moments, watching smoke spiral up from his pipe. "We know well the bite of such scorn," he said finally. "When men decide some are worth less than others, they forget Creator sees all hearts the same." He handed the journal back to Boone. "Tell us when this hearing comes. We will stand with your wife. The daughter honors her father's word. We will honor ours." Relief flooded through Boone. "Much obliged, Chief Nanton." "Your wife," Nanton said thoughtfully, "she has a strong spirit?" "Strongest I've known," Boone answered without hesitation. Nanton smiled. "Then perhaps Creator knew what he did, binding you two together, even if men's foolish game started it." The words followed Boone all the way home as he rode through the gathering dusk. Stars were pricking the sky when he finally reached the cabin. Warm light spilled from the windows, and the smell of beef stew made his stomach growl. Clara looked up from the stove as he entered, her face lighting with relief. "Was starting to worry," she said softly. ladling stew into a bowl. "You must be frozen through." Boone shed his coat and sat at the table, watching as she moved about the cabin. When she set the bowl before him, her hand brushed his arm in a gentle touch of gratitude. The simple gesture warmed him more than any fire could. "Chief Nanton remembers your father," he said between spoonfuls. "Says they'll stand with us at the hearing. Honor the promise about the spring." Clara sank into the chair beside him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Oh, thank the Lord," she whispered. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "And thank you, Boone, for riding out there, for standing with me in this." They sat together by the fire after supper, more united than they'd ever been. Outside, winter winds stirred through the pines, whispering of storms to come. Morning sunlight streamed through the church windows, casting long shadows across worn wooden pews. The sanctuary buzzed with whispers as townsfolk filed in, their Sunday best replaced by everyday wear for this impromptu hearing. Dust motes danced in the light, stirred by the restless movement of bodies settling into seats. Clara sat in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Boone stood beside her, his weathered face set like granite. Behind them, the cattle barons lounged with smug confidence, their expensive boots propped irreverently on the pewbacks. Judge Wilson, brought in from the county seat, settled behind a makeshift desk before the pulpit. His spectacles caught the light as he shuffled through papers. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts, sensing the tension in the air. "We're here today," the judge announced, his voice carrying to the rafters, "to examine the validity of the marriage between Boone Riker and Clara Mayfield." Marcus Fletcher, the lead cattle baron, strutted forward. His silver watch chain glinted as he produced a document with flourish. "Your Honor, we have testimony from multiple witnesses that this marriage was nothing more than a drunken wager. Mr. Riker here accepted a bet in the Last Chance Saloon to marry the preacher's daughter. Within a week." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara's cheeks flushed red, but she held her head high, though her lower lip trembled. "5 men signed statements," Fletcher continued, "swearing to the terms of the bet. $20 was the price, Your Honor. That's all it took to make this mockery of marriage." The judge frowned, examining the papers. "Serious allegations, Mr. Fletcher. And your interest in this matter?" "Why, only concern for proper order, Your Honor. And of course, the matter of the Mayfield Spring water rights, which would revert to county control if this marriage is voided." Before the judge could respond, the heavy church doors creaked open. A hush fell over the assembly as Chief Nanton entered, his presence commanding respect despite the simple dignity of his dress. Several of his men followed, their moccasins. Silent on the wooden floor, Reverend Mayfield, seated near Clara, straightened in his chair. Tears glistened in his eyes as he nodded a greeting to the chief. "Your Honor," Nanton spoke, his voice deep and measured, "I have traveled far to speak truth here today." The cattle barons shifted uneasily. Fletcher's face darkened. "This is a white man's legal proceeding. The chief is welcome to testify." Judge Wilson interrupted firmly. "Please continue, sir." Nanton moved to the front, his bearing regal despite the whispers around him. "I knew Reverend Mayfield well. He was a man of honor who understood water as the Creator's gift to all people. In times of drought, he promised to share his spring with my people. His daughter Clara now carries this promise." He turned to face the congregation. "You mock her size, but the Creator looks at the heart. This woman shows integrity that many men lack. She defends not just her land, but a sacred promise between peoples." Clara's eyes welled with tears. The preacher dabbed at his own eyes with a handkerchief. "That's all very touching," Fletcher sneered, "but it has nothing to do with the sham marriage. I have something to say about that." Boone's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "I took that bet, I married Clara for all the wrong reasons. But standing here now, I ain't never been prouder of any choice in my life." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Clara looked up at him, hope dawning in her eyes. "My wife," Boone continued, his voice growing stronger, "has shown more courage and dignity than any person in this town. She keeps her word, honors her fathers, promises, treats all folks with kindness, even those who mock her." He turned to face the judge. "I stand beside her now, not because of any bet, but because she's earned my respect and loyalty. Any man would be fortunate to call her wife." Tears rolled freely down Clara's cheeks now. Around the church, women dabbed at their eyes. Even some of the men looked away, shamefaced. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "Well, this is more complex than a simple contract dispute. I'll need time to consider all aspects before making any ruling." He gathered his papers. "This hearing is adjourned until further notice." The crowd began to disperse, but something had shifted in the air. Where there had been sneers before, now there were thoughtful looks. Where there had been mockery, now there was quiet reflection. Clara stood, her dignity intact despite her tears. Chief Nanton stepped forward and took her hand, speaking softly in his own tongue. Though she couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear in his respectful gesture. Boone moved to her other side, his shoulder brushing hers in silent support. The three of them stood together in the filtered sunlight, a picture of unlikely unity that made even the cattle barons pause as they filed out of the church. Snow lay thick on the mountain peaks, and bitter winds howled through the valley. Inside their small cabin, Clara stirred a pot of beans while Boone stamped snow from his boots by the door. The cabin glowed with warmth, both from the crackling fire and from the life Clara had breathed into it. "Sarah Miller's boy is down with fever," Clara said, ladling the steaming beans into a pottery bowl. "I thought I might take some soup over." "Tomorrow," Boone nodded, watching as she wrapped herself in a shawl and set the bowl aside for their neighbors. In the months since their wedding, he'd watched her transform their cabin into something he'd never imagined possible. A home where people gathered, where children's laughter echoed, where even the loneliest widow found comfort. That morning, they worked side by side in the bitter cold, their breath frosting in the air. Boone swung the axe while Clara stacked wood, her cheeks pink with exertion. When old Widow Jenkins stumbled through the snow, Clara immediately invited her in for hot coffee and cornbread. "You're too good to an old woman," Mrs. Jenkins said, warming her hands by the fire. "Nonsense," Clara replied, tucking a quilt around the widow's shoulders. "We're all God's children." Boone paused in the doorway, watching his wife's gentle ministrations. Pride swelled in his chest, surprising him with its intensity. This woman, whom he'd married on a cool bed, had shown him what true strength looked like, but not everyone appreciated Clara's goodness. The cattle barons, still smarting from their humiliation at the church hearing, watched with growing resentment. They gathered at the Last Chance Saloon, their whispers dark with malice. One evening, as winter's early darkness settled over the valley, Boone returned from checking his trap lines. The sight that greeted him stopped his heart. Orange flames licked the sky where their barn stood, and thick smoke billowed into the twilight. "Clara!" His voice cracked with terror as he spurred his horse forward. Through the smoke, he saw her. Clara stumbled from the barn side door, leading their frightened chickens. She coughed violently, her face streaked with soot. As Boone leaped from his horse, her knees buckled. He caught her before she fell, gathering her solid warmth against his chest. His hands trembled as he brushed ash from her face. "What happened?" "Had to. Save them," she wheezed, gesturing to the chickens now huddled in the snow. "Couldn't let them burn." Boone held her closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. The thought of losing her, This woman who had changed everything sent cold fear through his veins. "You could have died," he whispered hoarsely. Clara's hand found his cheek, leaving a smudge of soot. "The Lord watched over me," she said simply. They watched as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. Boone saw the signs clear enough. The hay had been doused with coal oil, the doors barred from the outside. This was no accident. At first light, Boone rode into town, fury burning in his gut. He found Sheriff Cutter at his desk, boots propped up, coffee in hand. "Those barons tried to murder my wife," Boone growled, slamming his palms on the sheriff's desk. "You going to do something about it?" Amos Cutter sighed, setting down his coffee. "Ain't got proof, Boone. Coal oil on the hay, doors blocked. What more proof you need?" "Law works slow sometimes," the sheriff said carefully. "But justice has a way of finding its mark." As if to prove his words, the town began to stir. Word of the barn burning spread, and people remembered Clara's kindnesses. By noon, wagons began arriving at their cabin. The Miller family brought lumber. The blacksmith's wife delivered a basket of eggs. Even the shopkeeper's children came with armfuls of nails. "We'll help you rebuild," Tom Miller announced, already rolling up his sleeves. "Ain't right. What was done to you folks?" Clara moved among their neighbors, offering coffee and thanks, her eyes bright with tears. Boone watched her, something profound shifting in his heart. He remembered the night he'd taken that foolish bet, how he'd seen only her size, only what others mocked. Now he saw her true beauty in her generous spirit, her unwavering faith, her quiet courage. As the day wore on, the frame of a new barn began to rise. Clara brought out bread and stew for the workers, and children darted about carrying tools. The air filled with the sounds of hammering and friendly chatter. "You've got yourself a fine wife there, Boone," old Tom said, pausing to wipe his brow. "Worth more than gold to that one." Boone nodded, his throat tight. He watched Clara comfort little Sarah Miller, who'd skinned her knee. His wife's laugh floated across the yard, warm as sunshine on snow. Love, he realized, had crept up on him slowly, built not on wagers or beauty, but on countless small moments of grace and strength. The snow fell thick and silent outside the cabin windows, casting the valley in a pristine white blanket. Inside, the fire crackled and popped in the hearth, sending warm shadows dancing across the walls. Clara sat in her rocking chair, quilting by lamplight, while Boone added another log to the flames. The isolation brought by winter's fury had drawn them closer, filling their evenings with quiet conversation, where once there had been awkward silence. Tonight, something weighed heavy on Boone's mind as he settled into his chair beside her. "Remember the night we met?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Clara's hand stilled on her quilt. "At the church, when you asked to marry me?" Boone's jaw tightened. The firelight caught the scars on his weathered face as he struggled to find words. "No, the real beginning. At the Last Chance Saloon." Clara looked up, confusion crossing her gentle features. "I never told you the truth," Boone continued, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair, "about why I asked for your hand." He drew a shaky breath. "It was a bet. Those men at the saloon, they were mocking you, and I took their wager. Sighed. I'd marry you within the week." The only sound was the pop of burning pine and the soft whisper of falling snow outside. Clara's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I was drunk and full proud," Boone pressed on, shame thick in his voice. "Never meant to follow through, but then everything happened so fast. You were so happy, thinking it was an answer to prayer, and I couldn't." His voice cracked. "I've carried this shame every day since." Clara's eyes glistened with tears in the lamplight, but she remained silent, waiting. "You deserve better than a marriage built on a cruel bet," Boone said hoarsely. "You deserved a man who could see your worth from the start, not a coward who had to learn it slow. "I'm sorry, Clara. More sorry than I've ever been for anything in my life." Clara set her quilting aside and rose from her chair. She crossed to where Boone sat, her steps quiet on the wooden floor. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Sometimes he writes straight with crooked lines. How can you forgive such a thing?" Boone whispered. "Because I've watched you change," Clara answered, her voice gentle but firm. "I've seen how you've stood beside me against the cattle barons, how you've defended our home, how you've grown. To care for our neighbors." She reached for his rough hand. "The bet may have brought you to my door, but it's not what kept you here." Boone's fingers closed around hers, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. Instead, he drew her closer until she stood within the circle of his arms. Clara's free hand came to rest on his shoulder as he pressed his forehead against her. Middle, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he murmured. "None of us deserve grace," Clara replied softly. "That's what makes it beautiful." They stood like that for a long moment, the fire warming their joined hands, while outside the snow continued its silent descent. When Boone finally lifted his head, the burden of months of guilt had lifted from his features. Clara's eyes shone with tears, but her smile was radiant. That night, Boone lay awake in his bed, listening to the wind howl outside. But for the first time, he felt no restlessness, no urge to flee. Instead, a profound gratitude filled his heart for the strange path that had led him here, to this cabin, to this woman, to this unexpected peace. Morning brought even heavier snow, the storm showing no sign of breaking. But inside their cabin, the atmosphere had transformed. Boone rose early, gathering his tools with purpose. The sound of his sawing and hammering filled the morning as he began crafting shelves for Clara's small collection of books, her Bible, her father's journal, and the few precious volumes she'd brought from the parsonage dot as he worked. A quiet whistle rose to his lips, an old trail song he hadn't thought of in years. From the kitchen, where Clara kneaded bread, came the sweet sound of hymns. Their melodies twined together, filling the cabin with something that had been missing before. The cold cabin where Boone had once lived alone had become something else entirely. With each board he shaped, each nail he drove home, he felt it more strongly. This wasn't just shelter from the storm anymore. In Clara's presence, in her forgiveness, in her steadfast love, it had become a true home, a hearth where love burned brighter than any fire. Spring arrived in gentle waves, melting snow, into trickling streams that fed the valley. The morning air grew sweeter, carrying the scent of wild sage and new grass. With the changing season came a shift in the town's mood. Like ice giving way to flowing water, the cattle barons, faced with the unwavering alliance between Clara, Boone, and the Ute people, slowly lowered their fists. Chief Nanton's dignified presence at town meetings reminded everyone that honor meant more than gold, and water rights were meant to be shared, not hoarded. On a bright Sunday morning, Boone and Clara walked hand in hand to church. Heads bowed respectfully as they passed, a far cry from the sneers of months past. Clara's hymns filled the wooden chapel, her voice strong and clear. Boone sat tall in the pew, his weathered face softened with pride at the church supper afterward. Clara moved among the tables with grace, her smile warm as sunshine. Women who had once whispered cruel words now sought her counsel about preserving fruit and tending sick children. Little ones clung to her skirts, begging for stories and the promise of fresh-baked cookies. Boone watched from across the room, his heart full. The Lord had indeed turned their shame into blessing, making something beautiful from that foolish bet in the saloon as the sun began to set. They loaded their wagon for home. Golden light spilled across the valley, painting the clouds in shades of rose and amber. Boone guided the horses onto the trail, then cleared his throat. "Clara," he said softly, "I love you." His voice grew stronger. "Not from duty, not from pity. I love you true." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she turned to him. "I have loved you since you first came to my door," she whispered. The wagon rolled homeward through the evening light, their hearts as peaceful as the settling dusk. Morning light sparkled on the spring water as Boone and Clara stood together at its edge. The stream bubbled clear and strong, carrying winter's melt down to the thirsty valley below. Clara's shawl fluttered in the breeze as she leaned against Boone's steady shoulder. Chief Nanton approached on foot, his dignified stride matching the rhythm of the flowing water. His dark eyes held wisdom as he extended his hand to Boone. Their handshake was firm, a bond between men who understood the worth of a promise. "This water," Boone declared, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd, "will be shared fair and square with all who need it." "That's my word." Clara's smile radiated joy as she watched her father's promise being honored. Nearby, children darted between adults, their laughter rising sweet and clear where cruel whispers once had been. The spring air felt alive with possibility. Boone turned to face their neighbors, his shoulders squared. "Folks need to know something," he announced. "I married Clara on account of a fool's bet. Shame on me for that." He paused, taking Clara's hand. "But now I see clear as day. She was God's answer to a prayer I was too stubborn to even speak. The Lord knew better than me what my heart needed." Clara's cheeks flushed pink as tears of happiness traced down her face. The gathered people nodded, moved by the simple truth of his words. That evening, in their snug cabin, Boone knelt by the hearth with his knife, carefully carving their initials into the stone. Clara spread her newly finished quilt across their bed, each stitch a testament to patience and love. Together, they knelt in the soft lamplight, their joined hands warm as they bowed their heads in prayer. Their voices rose as one, full of gratitude, while outside their window, the spring waters rushed onward, carrying life and promise to the waiting valley below. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.